This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me we're not telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Oh boy, what a show we have today. And what a crazy amount of wrestling history that took place in March in the 80s. Not the least of which what we're going to talk about with Midsouth today. But there was even a decent amount of stuff to talk about with WCW this week. Which is crazy because how much stuff was actually happening in the spring of 1989? Or at least stuff that was reasonably interesting to talk about. Not a ton. But these are the shows I look forward to. Plenty to cover, plenty to dive into, and we're going to get into all of it on today's 5 Starr Wrestling Report. Folks, we are the wrestling podcast that nobody knows but everybody needs. We are here on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays to bring you a well-rounded collection of classic wrestling coverage. Make sure to follow the channel and give the show a like if you have not already. Subscribe, comment. Anything to help out in the algorithms as YouTube continues its concerted efforts at shadow banning my channel. Scumbags. That's why I try to plug Rumble as much as I can, because have I ever mentioned that YouTube sucks? But it's the biggest multimedia platform out there for video content, so until Rumble supersedes them, this is what I have to work with. But as I said, got a ton of news to get into with today's program, so let's just get into the NWA review and see if we can manage to get this podcast to be under the 2-hour mark, because I do value people's time. And you want to talk about starting wrestling with a big news bulletin. Doesn't get much bigger than the opening to the March 18th episode of TBS Saturday Night. Now, if you've been following the NWA recaps over the last few months, there have been a couple times where I name-dropped the Great Muta in passing. There was nothing on the television program that really hinted at his debut. No mention from the commentators, no promotional packages, no promos. As a matter of fact, we have not seen Gary Hart on the show in several weeks. Well, this is where we got our very first look at the Great Muta in WCW. And alongside Gary Hart, his manager, we also had Hiro Matsuda to basically make his formal announcement. He establishes that Muta is an expert in multiple avenues of the martial arts: karate, jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai. He is what Gary ended up describing as Japan's greatest wrestling export. And albeit it was a little challenging to try to pick up on Matsuda's broken English at times, but I did write down here, he did more to explain who the Great Muta was here than he was in explaining why the hell he's been managing Ric Flair and Butch Reed for the last 2 frickin' months. So I thought his delivery was great. And Gary Hart, goes without saying, the man is a promo wizard. Always making sure to get over the important detail. It was kind of cool visually with the way they filmed this too. For the entirety of the promo, Muta's basically standing in doing his martial arts pose in front of the camera, just trying to look as sinister as possible. Then you have Gary Hart cutting the entire promo with his back turned to the camera. He's mainly talking with Matsuda through the whole thing. It was a delicate detail, but I thought that looked really cool from an audience perspective. It's kind of like when they had Sting do that post-Fall Brawl promo in '96 after War Games, where he essentially turned his back on the company by talking to the audience but never actually looking at the hard cam. And it was deliberately done that way to make a point, but it was perfect. I can't really say that this was done deliberately per se, but, seeing Gary not look at the camera while he was putting over the ominous, foreboding persona that was the Great Muta, it was crafty. Now, of course, the big thing that stands out if you go back and watch the footage, you might notice that when they flash up the graphic to show his name, it actually reads Great Muta, M-O-T-A, which is something I completely forgot about. Even though they were calling him Muta, his actual name graphic read Mota. And I never really figured out why that was, because they ended up just changing his name to the Great Muta within like a month or two of his debut. But I remember going back and seeing Great Muta footage for the first time when I was like 5 or 6 years old. It was right when my brother started introducing me to NWA footage from 89 and 90. First match I ever saw of Mutas. Him and the Stinger at the Great American Bash. And man, was he cool. He was a cool motherfucker. As big a fan of Sting as I became, when I watched that match with him and Muta from 89, I was all about Muta in that match. And of course, the thing people often reflect back on when you see his run in the NWA, the fact that they pushed him as a heel upon arrival, it was always one of those things where, I fell into the trap just like everybody else did. There was just no way that you were going to be able to thwart the fans getting behind him and wanting to cheer him. The fact that he was so good in the ring, had such a unique look and presentation to his gimmick, the fans were going to naturally start to get behind him no matter how hard they try to go against the grain. And trust me, they did. With every fiber of their being, they tried to prevent this man from being a babyface. And I think in essence, that's kind of why Muta's WCW run left a lot to be desired for people. The initial run. Because he'd obviously come back and make sporadic appearances for WCW through the early to mid-90s. I think he actually came back during the Nitro era and worked several matches. But he was constantly bouncing back and forth between here and Japan. He never really had a consistent full-time run. And if memory serves me right, there were plans to flip him babyface once the booking committee caught wind that the people were starting to gravitate toward him. But I think it was Gary Hart that got inside Muta's ear and said, "No, brother, you don't want to turn face. It'll kill your mystique." There's my terrible Gary Hart impression. And I think retroactively that wound up kind of killing Muta's motivation. And I don't know how much to read into the rumors about them wanting to put the World Heavyweight title on him. It's possible that was in the works at one point. I think from Gary's perspective, and it's a fair analysis to make, when you look at the roster in 89, how many true top singles heels did you really have at that point? You had Flair, but he was still in the World Heavyweight title hunt with Steamboat. Barry Windham was about to leave. Butch Reed was just kind of aimlessly floating around until they put him with Ron Simmons to make Doom. You had the Varsity Club to an extent, but I think they were better served working in the tag division since WCW really didn't have many options to work with there either. I mean, it was very much slim pickings around that time. So, even if I may not necessarily agree with the idea that Muta should have stayed heel because it would have killed his gimmick, I also understand the mentality of we need top heels to challenge Luger and Sting later on in the year, so let's just work with what we have and not try to rock the boat. But it was a great opening to the show. I think when you look back in 1989, the very few highlights there were throughout the year, Muta coming in, that would probably rank him on the top 3 or 4 moments easily. I just wish 89 wasn't the only year where he was working a more full-time schedule for WCW. Because once you got into 90, it's like he was there, then he was gone, then he would come back for a little bit and then disappear again. It was always hard for me to invest in him because he just wasn't around that steadily. Plus, they beat him into powder by that point. So now that I've spent the last 45 minutes talking about the Great Muta, and we're literally 4 minutes into the show by this point, let's talk about the other hour and a half of programming for the week. We open with Rick Steiner and Eddie Gilbert taking on Max MacGyver and The Enforcer, who was not in fact Double A. He was still in the WWF by this point. This was just a dweeb trying to steal Arn's gimmick. Missy was out on the floor in a short skirt, so you can pretty much venture a guess as to where my attention was to the entirety of this thing. Action was decent enough for the 3 minutes it went. As per usual, Rick was being a goofball the entire time. There was a funny moment where JR says, "If it weren't for pro wrestling, I'm not exactly sure what Rick Steiner would be doing with his life." Well, I can answer that. He'd be an active member of the local school board. But you never thought that would be a career path for Rick Steiner back in 1989. Rick got the win with a belly-to-belly on MacGyver. Then we had one of the most bizarre Sting promos I think I've ever heard. And think about the ground that covers. Between 87 and now. This was just like... I mean, I truly had a revelation when I listened to this promo. I am convinced a wrestler can be in a situation where they have nothing productive to ever say. But by God, if you just scream the dialogue and be all out of control and crazy, it'll always work. The key is, don't be boring. And I'll tell you what, brother, Sting's promos were many things back in the day. Boring is not one way to describe them. He literally stood here for 2 minutes, talked about meeting a couple fans at the airport. On its face, you're probably thinking, well, that really doesn't sound like a very interesting conversation. Well, it would be if the promo were being delivered by an ordinary man. Sting was no ordinary man. When you heard him talk about meeting fans at the airport, boy, did he make it seem like it was the greatest fucking thing of all time. Here's literally everything he discussed. And the key to all this, the fans went nuts. He met a couple dudes at the airport. They wanted to rap with him. For the record, I do not believe for a single solitary second that Sting would have ever attempted to engage in a rap battle. I highly doubt Sting has ever listened to rap music in his life. So they asked him what 1989 is looking like for his career. He said, "You're going to have to watch to find out. But it makes me excited. Just like seeing all the rowdy fans come up to the Stinger at the airport and say hi." That was it. That was the whole promo. Fans went up to Sting to say hi, and Sting had a heck of a time engaging with them. Hey, sounds like a really cool dude to be around. And or somebody that inhaled a little too much of the flake. From there, we go back to the ring for the Samoan SWAT team versus Rick Allen and Mike Justice. We learned during the match that they had officially signed the Samoans versus the Midnight Express for the Clash of Champions at the Superdome on April 2nd. Which, as you all know, did a barn burner number for NWA television. I guess we can coin it part one of the downfall of the Midnight Express in WCW. But we'll address that sad state of affairs in a couple weeks. Overall, not much to say about it. There was a line from Paul Heyman when he went over to the podium and said, "What's the main difference between Elvis Presley and Randy Rose?" Aside from just about everything. No, the actual answer is Elvis still makes money. Harsh. Samoans won after Samu gave Justice a backdrop off the middle rope. Then afterwards, they teased they were about to give him the combo splash. But then Paulie talked him out of it, and Fatu grabbed his phone and pretended to have a conversation on the other line. I imagine the dialogue was something to the effect of the following.
Ming, come on in, the big man from Tonga. Come on. A week from tomorrow night, you and Wrath. Now here's a man that perhaps is equal to you. The fact that he is 6'7", 6'8", and weighs well over 300 pounds should be a great contest.
Wait a minute. We are in America, please. You can speak English. You've been here long enough. We all know that. Now you're speaking Japanese. As friends, let's talk English. Now that's French. Please, Wrath is a big man. He's right now sizing you up because it's his biggest match to date here in World Championship Wrestling, Ming. Wait a minute. Am I going to get any English out of you here tonight or not? You understand, adios? Adios. Thank you very much, Ming. Wrath, 1 week from tomorrow night on pay-per-view at Halloween Havoc.
Still one of the greatest interview segments of all time. Let's see. We had a Varsity Club promo up next. These fucking Varsity Club promos, they get more and more outlandish as the weeks go by. We begin with JR talking with Kevin Sullivan about something pertaining to baseball. Sullivan had a Red Sox cap on, so whatever names they were bringing up here, it was out of my wheelhouse. I don't know jack shit about sports. All I know is there's a moment where Jim mentions something about Margot Adams, and Doc just goes, "Margot? Who's Margot?" JR just smiles and nonchalantly goes, "Never mind." So then we direct our attention to Mike Rotunda and the 10 grand. Still trying to find someone who can beat Rotunda for the TV title and win the money. They have now hired a personal accountant to basically safeguard the money. And, well, here's the rest of what I wrote down. Looking back, I'm pretty sure I'm not missing any important detail. Dan Spivey tried to say words, but Kevin Sullivan kept blowing his whistle at him. Probably as a means to get him to shut up because he fucking sucks at promos. And pretty much everything else pertaining to wrestling. Then Dr. Death started talking about the Superdome in New Orleans. Somehow he and Spivey got into an argument over something. I think Spivey was shit-talking the city, and Steve was like, hey, I have friends there. I don't know what the hell was going on. Can somebody explain how and when they just randomly decided to make Steve Williams a giant meathead? Seriously, his entire gimmick now is that he gets roid rage for no reason and can barely string 2 sentences together without sounding like the giant from Jack and the Beanstalk. I don't get it. So on the subject of TV debuts, in addition to Muta this week, we also saw Ranger Ross in action. He took on Lee Scott. And we talked about the 10-second clip they aired the other week where Ross mentioned his military background. We also had a little fun at his expense by citing the detainment in Ackworth, Georgia, when he robbed that bank back in 1996. After he had given himself up to federal agents, which is probably the funniest part of the whole story, I think he would have gotten away with it. So, he's an idiot. And a classy guy. I mentioned before, I remember very, very little about Ranger Ross in WCW. I know he came in right at the height of the Jim Herd era of trying to bring in all these gimmicks and trying to give everybody their own distinct persona on television. You know, with Ross having the Army background, the gimmick kind of seemed natural, and it wasn't insulting. It took JR less than 10 seconds before the bell rang to do a Ronald Reagan impersonation, trying to imitate what Reagan would have said had he interacted with Ranger in person. Well, I'm really proud of you, Ranger. Then, of course, Magnum TA just goes, that was good, Jim. For the record, it was a terrible impersonation. Worse than the one I just did. In terms of what he did here, his ring work was okay, if I wanted to be modest. Some of his amateur takedowns at the beginning were kind of sloppy, but he was a decent athlete. It's not to say he was absolutely horrible in the ring. It's just one of those things where you see the newer influx of guys coming in around this time. You know, we're fresh off the post-Crockett regime where you had the Ric Flairs, the Arn Andersons, the Tully Blanchards, the Ron Garvins, the Rock and Roll Express, the Barry Windhams, the Midnight Expresses of the world. It's like all these top-tier echelon names. And now we're getting Ranger Ross. A massive step down. And but like, if you were watching 89 without having any previous 3 to 4 year framework, you might look at a guy like Ranger Ross and think, no, he's not too bad. But compared to the previous crop of top names that you were seeing in the last several years, you're like, yeah, this guy kind of sucks. I was infuriated by the end of this thing because at the same time I was watching this boring TV match with Ranger Ross and Lee Scott, JR's announcing a Ric Flair, Barry Windham versus Eddie Gilbert, Lex Luger tag, and a Rick Steiner, Kevin Sullivan grudge match for NWA main event. The Sunday show. It's like, fuck, I want to see those matches. But no, instead I had to watch this. The ending to it had me laughing, though. They actually had Lee fucking Scott make a comeback on Ranger Ross. And after he went up and missed a diving elbow drop, Ross threw a couple drop kicks to Lee to send him flying out to the floor. At which point, he did a springboard leap over the top to the concrete, landed perfectly on his feet, and then he just grabs Lee, tosses him back in the ring so he can hit his combat kick for the 3 count. I'm like, your finish is a savate kick to the face after we literally just saw you do a picture-perfect aerial leap out to the floor? By the way, yes, the combat kick, that was his finisher. Not the super kick, but the combat kick. Because, well, he's former military, you see. I mean, you already know they're going to ram that finish name down our throats. From there, we had another Paulie Danger Zone talk segment. And his special guest this week was none other than the Junkyard Dog. Oh boy. I was gearing up for a rough sit-through here. Luckily, there's not a whole lot to talk about. Here's the entirety of everything that went down here. Paul invited out the dog. They had some brief banter back and forth. Paul asked for Dog's input on the Varsity Club and Ricky Steamboat, but he kept pulling the mic away so Dog couldn't actually speak. And then eventually Dog just got fed up and left. I kid you not, that was the entire segment. I have no earthly clue what the purpose of any of it was, other than to let everybody know that Paulie's a scumbag. And, I guess Dog just didn't give enough of a shit to punch him in the face and knock him out. I got nothing. Completely useless segment. Then we had Magnum out with Ranger Ross for a promo. And you know, I've got to give him credit. This was not a halfway bad promo. I thought Ross had a really solid delivery here. He briefly talked about his military background, mentioned a couple of the missions he undertook during his tenure, said that he's now transitioning to a wrestling career and looking to fight the best competition the NWA has to offer, especially that, quote, low-life rat soup-sucking dog chic. Well then, Ross, why don't you tell us how you really feel? And you know, it's one of those unfortunate moments where you think, man, that's a really good babyface promo to hype up Ranger Ross's first feud in WCW. And then you realize he's issuing a challenge to the Iron Sheik. And you're like, yeah, that's not going to go over well. Here's what's so funny about it, though. He literally stood at the podium and called the Sheik a rat soup sucking dog, or whatever the hell it was. Then they pitched to the ring where the Iron Sheik is set to wrestle next, but he's not out there yet. He's still hanging in the back somewhere. I'm like, did these two just walk past one another like two ships in the night? Didn't even acknowledge their existence? The guy literally called Sheik a piece of shit on live television. Sheik just apparently had nothing to say. He just went out to have his match. Didn't bother acknowledging Ross's promo. You know, he's out there waving the Iranian flag, going over to the podium to sing the Iranian national anthem. And then he proceeded to have a tremendously god-awful match with Dwayne Bruce. Not Dwayne Bruce. Dwayne Bruce. Just randomly threw in an extra E for the fuck all of it. It's like a Key and Peele sketch. Is there a Dwayne Bruce here today? You mean Dwayne Bruce? All right. So it's going to be like that. You better watch yourself, Dwayne. I ain't playing. Shit's going to get real. I need to go watch those skits again. It's been far too long. So yeah, the match was horrendous. Probably don't need to tell you that. The Iron Sheik was involved. There was a spot where Sheik was supposed to grab the ropes when Bruce went to throw a drop kick so he would hit the back of his head on the mat. I think Sheik just outright forgot what he was supposed to do. So then they just repeated the spot and then Sheik grabbed the ropes on the second attempt. Magnum at one point tried to point out how the Iron Sheik admired his physique too much. To which I asked, what physique? The one hidden under his giant beer gut? He eventually went with the Campbell clutch. It was the highlight of the entire show this week. The merciful ending to this atrocious television match. Somehow, some way, it wound up being 10 times worse than the match that followed. And to be honest, I don't know how that's humanly possible. Because this next segment, this was one for the ages. When I saw the goof standing in the ring for this next match, I honestly didn't know what to expect aside from sheer horror. But I knew it was going to be legendary. The match is Sting versus a name that I wish I were making up. Snake Brown. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, puke, or all of the above. I nearly puked when I saw the physical state of this jabroni. Try to picture this in your head. Every stereotypical TV movie you've ever seen about child predators or sexually deviant bad guys, this was him. He checked off all the boxes. He was a walking, breathing gimmick in every sense of the word. Aside from the incredibly horrendous body, he had the long, frizzy hair that looked like he stuck both of his fingers inside an electrical socket. Looked like he hadn't slept in days. And on top of that, he's out there doing every possible thing to try to get himself over. And you could tell he was the prototypical indie jobber if ever there was one. I have no idea how Sting got through this with a straight face. I mean, there were moments in this thing where you could visibly see him cracking a smile. And I do not for 1 second believe that was in character. I think he legitimately thought this may have been the funniest thing he'd ever seen. This fucking goofball is just being over the top with everything. Yelling at Sting from the onset. Being the most stereotypical territory heel. Telling Sting to watch the closed fists. And his eyes are bugging out the whole way through. He's trying to yell for the fans to stop cheering. And like, I mean, on the one hand, you can't help but laugh as a viewer watching. But I can only imagine as somebody who has to work with a guy like this. If you are in this situation, what are you supposed to do? You can blatantly see the guy is going into business for himself and not doing the task he was assigned. Do you just start shooting on him and to try to legitimately rough him up to teach him a lesson? Or do you just do what Sting did here and laugh about it? I mean, the guy couldn't do a basic lockup, so it's not like they could even fake their way through the match. Every single movement and gesture from this idiot, it was straight out of a cartoon animation. Sting at one point just yelled out, "You're a loud one. Oh, I love it." And this Snake Brown sure was loud. He was loud, obnoxious, and hilariously over the top. And again, I'm obviously having fun here because the segment was completely out of control. Actually, you know what? I literally just thought about this, and I shit you not. I think I figured out who Snake Brown reminds me of. He is the goon from the Three Stooges. No joke. Look him up. Go to Google, type in goon from the Three Stooges. That is Snake Brown. I am totally convinced that Snake played that character now. That is fucking amazing. Damn, I'm good. Can't believe I just thought about that on the spot. Hey man, any references I can date back to the 40s and 50s, that is good stuff. This was truly an iconic segment in the history of television. Sting went over with the Scorpion, which, again, I seriously don't know how to react to the way Snake Brown sold this afterwards. After Sting breaks the hold, you see Snake Brown start to flop around on the ring mat like a fish. And then he rolls outside the ring and does a full body rotation wherein you basically see him completely no-sell the move and start acting like a deranged animal. He did the thing that the Black Ninja used to do on Midsouth television, where he'd stick his hands out and then do a 360 rotation around in a circle. I was like, what the hell was going on? If I were Sting, I'd have probably gone over there and kicked him in the balls. Not even kidding. That is just unprofessional on so many levels. I can totally buy that Sting was having the time of his life out there and just didn't give a shit one way or the other. But dude, Could you imagine if this was like Snake Brown versus a Tully Blanchard or an Arn Anderson? If they allowed that guy to leave the building unscathed, he'd have been the luckiest man alive. Christ on a cracker. You have to go watch this to understand how mesmerizing it was. Sting versus Snake Brown, WCW 1989. One of the most remarkably unique segments I've ever covered on an NWA show in quite some time. And there have been a lot of weird, strange segments on the studio shows. And to think about this for a minute, they go from that, whatever on God's green earth that was supposed to be, to a pre-taped interview with Ricky Steamboat. That is a massively divergent change of pace. That is the equivalent of following a New York City bar fight with an NPR discussion on book topics. Now, this is most definitely not your prototypical Ricky Steamboat interview. He actually showed a little bit of honest-to-God fire here. And rightfully so. I mean, you think about all the trash-talking Ric Flair's been doing lately, with Ricky Steamboat being overseas in Japan and not having the opportunity to respond to Flair's comments. Well, here he was to set the record straight. He says he's sick to death of having to hear Flair claim that he is still the World Heavyweight Champion. And everybody knows that he lost the belt to Ricky fair and square at the Chi-Town Rumble. And for the last month, Ricky's been defending his championship against the top Japanese competition. And then just to dig that knife further into the theoretical jugular, he told Flair that he noticed a significant increase in his paycheck since becoming the new champion. But not for 1 second is he stealing Flair's money or stealing his glory and spotlight. He's making the big bucks off his own hard work and dedication. Right now, Flair is a desperate man, and desperation only leads to turmoil. Flair can name the time and the place. Steamboat will be ready to defend his championship. But until then, he can stop claiming to be the champ, because Steamboat is the man. It was a heck of a promo. Probably the best promo I've ever heard Steamboat cut. And hey, imagine that. Goes back to what I said earlier. When you show passion and vigor in your promo delivery, or you just scream the whole thing like a raging lunatic, 99% of the time it'll get over. So Ricky's caught on to the magic ingredient. Just be loud and boisterous. Then we had Mike Rotunda versus Richard Sartain, television title match. And the 10 grand. I just noticed. There was a match with Mike Rotunda and Richard Sartain. And if you combine their names, you get Mike Sartain. I suspect there's no direct relation between the two here. Although Michael's in much better physical shape than this Richard Sartain fella. I mean, it's a fine get-over match. Worked over the guy and then won with a guillotine hold. Again, this is all part of the story they're doing right now with Rotunda putting up the TV title and the $1,000. I was hoping someone would eventually come out and pull that fucking whistle out of Sullivan's mouth. But it didn't happen. Now, they made the announcement here that on March 30th, they were relocating to Center Stage in Atlanta for all future tapings. Which is historically big news if you're an NWA fan. Techwood Drive was the home to the NWA for all their tapings. But, this is part of their way of upgrading and trying to make things look a little more professional for television, which, I get it. Selfishly, I always like the smaller studio setup with the 50 to 100 fan attendance, just because of my traditional old school mentality when it comes to studio wrestling. When they took everything to center stage, as professional and well laid out as everything looked, it just took away from the studio atmosphere. And I think it just kind of came off like a standard wrestling program at that point. Granted, they quadrupled in size for fan attendance, which gave the shows a more livelier and house show type atmosphere. But it just wasn't the same when they left the old Techwood Drive location. Then we had JR doing a pre-taped interview with Ric Flair. And this was one of those promos where, after having watched Will Sasso's interview with Chris Van Vliet and hearing him do the Ric Flair parody about all the standard studio promos we used to hear from back in the day, I legitimately cannot watch a Flair promo now without thinking of Sasso. He completely exposed the reality of every goddamn Ric Flair promo from the 80s. It is literally a combination of catchphrases and him just naming big towns. That's every Flair promo in a nutshell. It doesn't matter if it's Boston, Massachusetts, Baltimore, Maryland, Greensboro, South Carolina, Miami, Florida, Bucksnort, Tennessee. That's literally the only way I'm ever going to be able to hear Flair's promos now. Just him naming the most obscure cities and towns that nobody's ever heard of, directly after he mentions all the big cities. It's true, every single time. He'll start by going, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and then he'll just name a completely never before heard of city in North Carolina. It's fucking hilarious. Because it's so accurate. I can't even say Will was being hyperbolic, because we've reviewed 3 fucking years of Ric Flair promos on this channel. Every one of them is exactly that. You talk about the 4 horsemen, you call yourself champ, talk about limousine riding and jet flying, talk about fucking a couple girls, then you just name a bunch of big cities and towns. Then you say, if to beat the man, you gotta beat the man, pal. You gotta walk the aisle. Woo! He's the best. Well, Ric Flair, that is. Will Sasso's a cool dude too. And then we had a total arbitrary 6-man tag with Steve Casey, Dick Murdoch, and JYD taking on The Raider, Chance Myers, and John Brewer. I seriously think they just pulled 6 random names out of a hat and said, sure, that works. Steve Casey, Dick Murdoch, and the Junkyard Dog. That is pretty goddamn random. I don't know what was going on with Steve Casey in this match, but he was totally out to lunch. Just one brain fart after another. First he got on the second turnbuckle to tease giving a move while Dog had one of the job guys restrained. But then he just got down so they could hit a double clothesline. Then he brought one of the guys over to the babyface corner and just couldn't figure out what the hell to do with him. So Murdoch just pulled him out to the floor. Then he hit a terrible clothesline like a minute later. Why do I not remember Steve Casey being this bad? Well, probably because I haven't thought about him as a worker in years, because he was such a non-entity. Keep in mind, he was wrestling in the same match as the Junkyard Dog, who was arguably the worst wrestler they had on the roster at this point. I don't even remember what happened. Dog pinned somebody with a headbutt. We had Eddie Gilbert and Rick Steiner at the podium for an interview. Gilbert took a minute to put over a bunch of the baby faces. Then he started ripping into Paulie dangerously, saying the only reason he managed to get a talk show segment is because he practically begged George Scott. I think that's the first time they've ever mentioned George Scott on this program. And I highly doubt most people even knew he was the booker at this time, unless you were a real insider. And then he talked about the Varsity Club, told Mike Rotunda whenever he has the guts, he can put his television title up against a real challenger. And that took us back to the ring for Dr. Death and Dan Spivey versus Jerry Price and Greg Brown. How many times have we heard the Varsity Club theme on this show now? Is this the third consecutive time? God. I'm going to have that Syracuse fight song ingrained in my head forever. The only thing I wrote down about it was that at least they were smart enough to figure out that Spivey should use a powerbomb as a finish, as opposed to a standing bear hug. Small steps. And then we had Muta's in-ring debut. Or, again, as his graphic read, Great Muta. Very glad that name did not stick around for long. He wrestled Cougar Jay for his very first televised match. And again, we talked about it at the beginning of the report. It was going to be virtually impossible to keep this guy as a heel in the long haul. Like, even watching him here, you still had a good chunk of the studio fans applauding whenever they would see Muta do something cool, like the springboard crossbody or the flip over the top rope where he landed on his feet. Super kick out of the corner, which scored on the pinfall. I mean, he was way too cool to hate. The face paint, the quickness and agility of him, the way he carried himself versus most of the roster. Like, everything about him just screamed badass. Now, granted, he only wrestled for a minute here. It's not like we were getting the full taste of what he could do. And even when you listen to Gary Hart's promo afterwards, at the same time he's putting over Muta, trying to establish him with the American market, since I'm sure a lot of people legitimately had never seen him or heard of him before. Nothing about his promo really indicated that Muta was a bad guy. So there is a certain level of confusion as a fan when you're watching, as you're trying to figure out how you're even supposed to react to him. He's just kind of mesmerizing and captivating, but you don't really want to sit there and boo him. Like, even as a kid growing up, age 5 or 6 years old, someone that never even heard, much less seen Japanese wrestling footage at that time, I mean, I instinctually gravitated to like Muta because he was so different and so unique. Then as I went back and saw a lot of the work with him and Masahiro Chono, him and Vader. I mean, one of the most underrated tag matches of the 90s was a match I saw with him and Sting against the Steiners at the Tokyo Dome in 92. I think, was that considered the inaugural January 4th Tokyo Dome show? I mean, go watch that match if you've never seen it. And then go watch every Steiner Brothers tag match in Japan, and you'll be sold on why they were one of the all-time great tag teams. You know what wasn't an all-time great tag match? Butch Reed and Rip Morgan versus Bob Emery and Tony Suber. What the hell were they doing with Hacksaw Reed in early 89? This guy was absolutely directionless. They paired him with Rip fucking Morgan, of all people. I mean, God bless Rip Morgan. I have nothing against the guy, but they've been mostly using him as a jobber since the Sheepherders left for the WWF last year. Now they got him teaming with Butch Reed. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with the match. Kind of worked it as a big man hoss fight where they just beat up the job guys and hit a bunch of power moves. Of course, Tony Suber was a bigger guy himself, so kind of became a clash of styles at certain points. Reed won with a flying shoulder block. I think I'm literally at the point with so many of these studio squashes where I just have nothing to say. Like, it used to be back in the day, there'd be a couple spots to talk about, or, hey, check out this crazy thing that made me laugh. Unless Snake Brown is involved, I think most of the time now is just, they're doing some moves and somebody hits their finish. Did I mention the match was Butch Reed teaming with Rip Morgan? Where did that ever go? The answer is absolutely nowhere. We did at least close with a highlight this week. I cannot believe they actually aired this, but trust me when I tell you, it did not disappoint. Well, first we need to backtrack to set the stage. Last week, during a Paulie Danger Zone interview with Lex Luger, it was announced that Luger would be teaming with Michael Hayes to wrestle in the Omni. And when I heard that announcement, I was floored. I was like, there is no possible way these two are going to have any kind of chemistry together. Michael Hayes and Lex Luger, that is the epitome of oil and water. They are polar opposites in every way imaginable. But lo and behold, they actually aired their match from the Omni. And I just figured, okay, they're going to wrestle a couple job guys. I don't remember them announcing they would be wrestling Barry and Kendall Windham. So this was an actual featured match for the card. Of course, you already had the inbuilt issue between Windham and Luger over the U.S. Heavyweight title and all the fallout from the Chi-Town Rumble. And their work together in this match was outstanding. Now, some people might not put a whole lot of thought into it because we're talking about Lex Luger here. Guy was a genetic freak of nature. The fact that he could effortlessly press slam Barry Windham, of all people. Mind you, not a small man. It's impressive. So they're going back and forth for a few minutes. It's pretty fun action. But the real story is everything that happened at the end, which, albeit, came off as more of a swerve than anything else, as opposed to some well-crafted, well-thought-out storyline they had in the works. So, Barry and Luger are doing pretty much 99% of the work. And at the very end, Michael Hayes tags in. He does a few collar and elbow tie-ups with Barry in the corner. Clean breaks from Barry on both occasions, which seemed a little odd. And they do a spot where Luger goes over and high-fives Barry's injured left hand, which results in all four guys getting in the ring and doing the standoff. And then in one of the more questionable heel swerves we've probably covered throughout this NWA review series since we began back in 1985, And we've covered a lot of heel turns. Michael P.S. Hayes turns on Luger, and he helps the Wyndham brothers score the fall over him. And it was certainly out of left field. I will admit, not only do I not remember this angle ever taking place, I never suspected anything when they announced it on television the other week. Now, granted, it was always a weird idea on paper to see Michael Hayes and Lex Luger teaming together for a random tag match in the Omni. But I just figured, okay, it's a house show. Two babyfaces to throw together for a match. It's not out of the ordinary. Turns out it was part of something bigger. And I remember Hayes becoming a heel when he and Jimmy Garvin reformed the Freebirds later this year. I never really connected the dots on how they ever got to flipping him heel in the first place. The execution of it was fine. Here's what didn't make sense to me, though. They tried to play this up as Hayes taking a payoff from Hiro Matsuda so he would help them screw over Luger to help his team win. Which, okay, don't really have a problem with that. But they never really established any kind of story going in to bring this all together. Like I said, I had no idea they were even wrestling Barry and Kendall until we saw the clip. I just figured they were teaming up because they needed a pair of babyfaces and said, let's pair up Luger and Hayes. So in a way, they basically told an entire story without ever really establishing the plot. So it kind of came off very haphazard. He kind of had to figure Hayes returning to the NWA as a babyface in late 88, early 89. That was only going to be temporary. Him teaming with JYD, it just never seemed right. He'd been floundering in the undercard since he came back. So while I certainly don't have an issue with them turning on Luger here, the way they got there just seemed very rushed and hastily thrown together. Like they realized last minute, hey, we don't really have a whole lot of heel challengers for Luger right now. So who can we flip to give him guys to feud with? And I guess Michael Hayes was the easy go-to. In retrospect, can you sit here and say that Luger was kind of an idiot for not seeing it coming? Yes and no. Hayes was never really teasing anything on television to give you the indication that he was about to turn. But again, you look at his booking and the way he's been utilized on TV since he came back. You can kind of visualize how they would get to that point. But again, the whole thing with Matsuda allegedly giving Hayes a payoff to fuck over Luger, I think I would have bought that more if they actually established that as any kind of motive on last week's show. Like, if they would have told us that they were wrestling Barry and Kendall in the Omni, then I could sit there and be like, all right, maybe Hayes is playing Luger here. So there's just a couple little details missing in between. But overall, it wasn't a bad turn. Hayes is always a much more believable heel than he is a babyface. Of course, I'm also using 3 years of world-class tape to support my biased claim. But come on. Babyface Michael Hayes versus heel Michael Hayes. They don't even compare. It is sad to think that this was probably only done because they needed to find Luger some heel challengers in the interim. Then they just wind up turning Luger heel by the summer anyway, right before they kickstart the feud with him and Steamboat. I don't even remember the whole backstory to how Luger ended up turning on Steamboat in the first place. It's been so long since I've gone back and seen the intermediary footage. But, they got something lined up for him in the meantime. Luger versus Hayes. That is a U.S. title program of some description. I imagine the promos will be 1,000,000 times better than the actual matches. Because I don't remember a thing about any of their matches together. Other than the fact that they probably weren't very good. But with that, I think I spent enough time talking about this one. Not as horrible of a show as last week, but outside the debut of Muta, the closing angle that we saw here with Hayes and Luger, it's still WCW in early '89. That period largely sucked. I did get mild enjoyment out of that Sting Snake Brown match. I might go back and rewatch that again just to amuse myself. Trust me, it was very much a spectacle. Well, I'll try not to spend an hour and a half on this Midsouth review, but no promises. Got a ton of notes here, and I want to make sure I cover everything, because boy howdy, what a show this was. Featuring an all-time classic pro wrestling angle. And one of the recurring themes with Mid-South television over the last month is that they've been starting each program with a lot more recap packages. So like the first 10 to 12 minutes of every episode is filled with a lot of detail. And this week was no different. The big item of business at the top of the program were 2 recent championship title changes. We had Mr. Wrestling 2 defeating the Junkyard Dog in New Orleans at the Superdome on March 12th. He is now the new North American champion. Likewise, about 4 or 5 days later, Wrestling 2 and Magnum finally dropped the Mid-South tag belts to the Midnight Express in Lafayette, Louisiana. And the reason for the controversy surrounding the North American title situation is that the Dog was supposed to wrestle this week in the next round of the TV title tournament. He was scheduled to face Crusher Khrushchev. However, due to the finish of the Wrestling 2 versus Dog title match in New Orleans, Dog was unable to compete this week because of an injury he sustained. And so out comes Wrestling 2 to join Bill Watts at ringside. And it's one of those classic babyface heel banters where Watts is giving the pragmatic point of view to the situation, talking about what really happened, as evidenced by the tape we were about to see. Meanwhile, Wrestling 2 is trying to spin it his way and say, I didn't do anything wrong. And so you ask, well, what happened? Well, to be quite honest with you, based on the clip they played here, I still don't entirely agree that Wrestling 2 was in the wrong. Hear me out. The claim from Bill Watts was that Wrestling 2 reached into his tights to pull out a gimmick knee brace so he could knock out the Dog and steal the belt. Apparently, after hitting Dog several times with running knee lifts in the match and not being able to put him down, so he was desperate. And, I mean, it's a very bold claim on Mr. Watts' behalf. I don't entirely put it past Wrestling 2 to cheat, given his attitude and his, again, desperation to become the North American champion just to stick at the Magnum TA. However, and I know I'm being deliberately facetious here, but just bear with me. There's a point to this. The clip basically showed Wrestling 2 with a knee brace on. And it was funny because you look at the image when they go to a freeze frame. 2's got this giant fucking knee brace on that takes up like 2/3 of his entire body. But they still have to do the thing where they put the spotlight on his knee brace to darken out the rest of the image, just to make sure everybody can see it. As if nobody's going to see this massive gimmick he's got on. But here's the thing that makes me laugh. Nothing in the clip they played gave any indication that Wrestling 2 was pulling out some kind of illegal gimmick to stuff inside the knee brace, which I believe was Watts' entire claim. But the clip was just, oh, hey, look, Wrestling 2's got a knee brace on. It's very peculiar. Unless, and it's entirely possible that I misheard it, unless the knee brace itself was supposed to be the actual gimmick, which I can see. I mean, Wrestling 2 doesn't normally wrestle with knee pads anyway, so it does seem oddly suspicious. But then they cut back to 2, and he's like, I was simply pulling up my knee pad because it was slipping down. That's all there was to it. So he was wrestling with a knee pad on through the whole match? You see what I mean, though, right? I mean, the whole clip was like 5 seconds. There was no way you were going to be able to distinguish who was telling the truth in this situation. Even though it's supposed to be blatantly obvious that 2 cheated to win. But that whole part was great. And of course, what makes it even more humorous is that at the same time Wrestling 2 just won the North American Championship, he also just lost the Midsouth tag belts a few days later. He totally does not give a shit. He's got the top singles belt now, and tag titles be damned. He doesn't care about those pieces of junk anymore as yesterday's news. So we go to the footage and see the closing minutes where Wrestling 2 walks out on Magnum right before the Midnights used a tennis racket to steal the belts. They didn't really explain the context as to what prompted Magnum to get left high and dry, but I presume Wrestling 2 just said, fuck it. And he left. And we all know Wrestling 2's basically fed up with Magnum to begin with. Now, of course, there were also stipulations set up beforehand. In addition to the belts being on the line, the losing team would have to receive 10 lashes apiece, which is a stipulation tailor-made for the heels to go over. But this was actually really creative with what they did here. The idea was that Magnum and Wrestling 2 would both receive 5 lashes each, but since Wrestling 2 walked out, that basically left poor Magnum to have to take all 10 lashes by himself. And of course, you know with the Midnights, they were going to milk those shots for everything they were worth. It was going to be 2 for Dennis, 2 for Bobby, and 1 for that greasy slimeball monkey Jim Cornette. The monkey slur was the term Bill Watts used. But this was cool. Terry Taylor stepped up to the plate to be the sacrificial lamb for Magnum. He said, I won't let you take all 10 shots. You took your 5. I'll take the 5 on behalf of that piece of shit coward Wrestling 2. Which is exactly what he did. That's a good friend. Find yourself a friend that'll take belt shots for you. Now, of course, the whole time this is going on, I'm peripherally watching the Lafayette crowd, and they're all on their feet screaming and cursing at the heels. You get the police officer down at ringside just waiting for somebody to hit the ring so he could tackle him and hit him with his nightstick. Thankfully, this did not ensue a riot, but I was waiting for it. Great facials from Magnum and Taylor when they were taking those belt shots. I mean, you can only gimmick a strapping so much, especially when you're taking it right across the brunt of your spine. So I'm sure they were taking a real beating there. But it made a man out of them. Now, if you were to ask me, is there anybody in the wrestling business that you would ever consider taking a leather strapping from? Well, beautiful Bobby Eaton ain't a bad option to go with. I don't know about Dennis, but I know the kind of good-hearted person Bobby was back in the day. At least I knew he would try to protect me as much as possible. What a phenomenal opening 10 minutes to the show. And what a great closer, too, when Watts is telling two, yeah, you used to have a great deal of respect from these fans, but now, because of your recent actions, you've lost a lot of that original following. And Wrestling 2 just goes, I haven't lost a thing. I'm the North American champion. Ha 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 ha. What a fucking douche. And he's not wrong. Then we returned from break to catch a quick highlight package of last week's Midnight Rock and Roll Showdown, mainly so they could replay the Russians running out at the very end to cut Ricky Morton's hair as part of that heat angle. Once again, getting to hear that classic Jim Ross hysteria commentary. The Russians are cutting Ricky's hair! The Russians are cutting Ricky's hair! I mean, it was the equivalent to the British are coming in the wrestling pantheon. Watts also mentioned the tragic passing of one of the local fans that used to come attend all the Shreveport tapings. Said he was killed in an oil rig. God. Really sad. But he said he was a very passionate fan and never missed a single taping. Isn't that crazy to think that there were periods during the territory days where the wrestlers and the promoters actually knew the fans personally? The ones that would always come to the shows, sat in the same seats. That's a lost art in today's business, man. It's a damn shame. You know, back when you had a real sense of community between your wrestling company and the local townspeople that would always show up to buy tickets, and they were known by name. I mean, some people are too young to even conceptualize something like that in today's market. But that's how it used to be. You had your die-hard fans that would always buy tickets to come see the shows in person. The regulars. And I'm using the term die-hard in a very different context with talking about territory wrestling. From there, we go to the ring for Jerry Gray and Pat Rose versus the Rock and Roll Express with Ricky Morton's new haircut. And by new haircut, I literally mean he looked exactly the same he did last week after the Russians had already cut off a piece of his mullet. So the moral to the story is, Russians suck at using scissors. They wrestled for about 90 seconds, and then Ricky and Robert won with a double drop kick. We're tracing our roots back to every single rock and roll tag we ever discussed on the TBS Superstation from 86 and 87. They hit some athletic moves. Double drop kick finish. 1, 2, 3. And David Crockett jizzes himself with excitement. But that, ladies and gentlemen, brought us to one of the all-time greatest segments in wrestling. not just Mid-South, wrestling in general. I've been waiting with bated breath over the last several months to finally get to talk about this, because I knew it was coming. And here we are, the moment of truth. And dude, let me just say from the onset, I've probably gone back and watched this fucking thing at least 100 to 200 times in my lifetime. Maybe more. For me as a fan, this is on par with the infamous Sid Vicious breaking his leg on WCW pay-per-view, or Ric Flair doing snow angels on the floor of the TBS Superstation when he's flipping out on the babyfaces for making snide comments. No matter how many times I go back and watch it, it will never cease to make me laugh. There are just certain angles and certain promos in wrestling that remain timeless. Things that you could never replicate if you tried. They could have gone back and refilmed this thing 4 or 5 times. It would never have beaten the original take. They did this all in one shot. It was perfect. And I'm obviously referring to the Midnight Express Tag Team Championship Celebration segment. The single greatest moment on Mid-South television we've covered yet. And I'll explain why. Aside from the fact that it was absolute golden comedy. There were just so many little things at play when you sit back and watch this and you say, everything about this presentation is utterly ridiculous on its face. But because of the fact that they're supposed to be slimeball heels, and we're supposed to view them as giant fucking sissies, it makes the whole thing like 10 times more hilarious. These guys are so proud of becoming Mid-South Tag Team Champions, despite the fact that they essentially won the belts in what became a glorified handicap match, and they still had to cheat by using a tennis racket. That's already brilliant. The fact that Jim Cornette said, I'm going to pay for airtime to throw a party for my boys. A special occasion just to make sure everybody knows how iconic this moment is. And you're thinking, okay, 3 grown men that just won championship gold for the first time in Mid-South. It'll probably be some formal thing. They'll be out there in suits, maybe have some female escorts, some expensive decor and finger foods. It'll be something that presents these guys as cocky, conceited snobs. Oh no. No, in fact, they went in the polar opposite direction of that. They're at ringside with JR. Not only are Bobby and Dennis dressed in their ring attire, but they've also got party hats on. They're blowing into those party horn gimmicks that you see at birthday get-togethers for fucking 9-year-olds, where kids are being overly obnoxious and trying to draw as much attention to themselves as possible. So already they come off like absolute geeks. And they got other party favors like balloons and confetti and just all this geeky shit that make them look like they're all 12. And of course, there's a blue cake on the table. So you immediately know where this is all going if you know anything about professional wrestling tropes. It's one of those hilarious deals where the Midnights are out there having the time of their lives. Jim Cornette's cutting the heel promo while Bobby and Dennis are drinking their $100 champagne. Bobby's reaching into a brown paper bag and throwing confetti in the air. It is the lamest fucking party you've ever seen. But these guys think it's the greatest thing in the world. which is amazing. JR's just standing there thinking, there's no way these guys get pussy. So everything about it is fantastic. The over-the-top nature of it. And, well, on the subject of the champagne thing, I did laugh when JC had to get in the line about him not drinking alcohol, but that he would have a Pepsi later. Just yet again playing into the gimmick that Corny's a giant weenie. Or as Watts would say, a sissy. This was still back before Cornette switched to Sprite. And so then this segment became truly iconic. It was already iconic, but then it became even better. If there's anything better than seeing a group of douchey heels make asses of themselves, it's douchey heels that are also stupid and dumb while making asses of themselves. So Corny finally brings up the cake, says that he's going to cut the pieces while Bobby and Dennis go over and taunt the fans with party favors. And for the record, that was a Jim Cornette call. He deliberately said, boys, take those party favors and go all the way across the room away from me so that I'm left vulnerable standing in front of this giant, massive cake. There's absolutely no way anything wrong could possibly happen in this situation. There's my smart fan translation. And so, lo and behold, it leads to the exact thing you would expect. While Bobby and Dennis are about 50 to 100 feet away from Cornette mocking the fans, you see Jim bending over to cut the cake, leaving himself in prone position. While the heels are totally oblivious to what's about to go down, they start to zoom the camera back just a little bit, and you look around the room, and all the fans are starting to erupt and get out of their seats because they can see way off in the distance the Rock and Roll Express are running over to drive Cornette's face right into the cake. And that is precisely what happened. Ricky and Robert stuff Corny's face into the cake. They just bury his entire head into this goddamn thing. And for the record, this is a huge cake. So it got messy in a hurry. And of course, Bobby and Dennis finally catch wind of what's going on. So they run over and chase off the Rock and Roll as they try to help Cornette to his feet. And you get that classic image where Corny's entire face is covered with icing and cake batter. His legs are hyperextended in both directions as he's overselling the fuck out of it. Boyd Pierce and Bill Watts are howling with laughter the whole way through. I don't think I've ever heard Watts laugh in the manner he did here. He was overjoyed to see this loudmouth heel manager finally get his comeuppance. And here's the great thing about the way this was all done. You look at it from the fan perspective of how the Rock and Roll ran in to finally cake Cornette in the first place. Everybody in the building, except the heels, saw this coming. Jim Ross was facing in the direction of where Ricky and Robert were coming from. The fans were looking in the direction of where Ricky and Robert were coming from. And like with JR too, he could have easily tapped Corny on the shoulder and bed, "Hey, watch your back, kid." But even JR thought, I'm just going to sit back and let this happen because it's going to be funny as fuck. It's amazing. And again, you get the aftermath where Cornette is totally speechless. He does that classic girl shriek into the microphone. The only thing, and I swear to God, this is the only nitpick I ever have about this looking back. The only thing that would have made this even funnier is if right as Bobby and Dennis were running over to try to run off the Rock and Roll Express, if they were caught on camera tripping, which would have obviously prolonged the angle. But I mean, dude, what else can you say? It was fucking classic. I still go back and watch it all these years later, and I can't help but laugh. There's just so much stuff that naturally fell into place here that never came off as forced or contrived. Like, you think about it in today's context. We've seen cake angles done in pro wrestling so many times over the years, but you always know that it's just phony comedy. You know that it's overly rehearsed and everybody's in on the gag because they've seen it a million times. This was a totally different situation. Nothing about this came off phony. It was just a simple way to humiliate a group of bad guys that have been a thorn in everybody's side for months. Just having a little bit of fun at everybody's expense. And boy, you could tell how much fun everybody was having here. Certainly the announcers. Bill Watts had probably never seen anything that hysterical in his life up to that point. Now, spoiler for later in the show, they do end up replaying this angle at the very end. And as we'll see, leading up to then and the next couple weeks of television, there is heavy story implication for them doing that. But I don't need to sit here and tell you that you need to go watch it for yourself. It's on YouTube. Just go search it. It's one of the best 2 minutes of Mid-South television in history. And that led us to Terry Taylor versus Nikolai Volkov. A lot of bad blood with these two, as we already know. And I don't know if I mentioned it earlier when we went over it, but because of JYD having to forfeit his tournament round to Khrushchev, that also means Khrushchev automatically advances to the final round. Meanwhile, Taylor still has to go through another semifinal round to advance. Now, the action was solid enough, but the ending was really the main takeaway. After Taylor had drop-kicked Volkov over the top of the floor, Khrushchev ran out to try to complain to Pee Wee Anderson about calling for a DQ. And they end up doing a quick series where Volkov goes for the backbreaker press on Taylor, but Taylor reverses, tries to go for a roll-through pin on Volkov. Then Khrushchev hits the ring for the DQ. And then as they go to put the hangman's rope around Taylor's neck, outruns Hacksaw Duggan for the big save. Big pop for that. And he ends up clocking the Russians over the back with a 2x4. And let me tell you, gimmick board or not, he smacked the shit out of Darso with that board, man. God, you could hear that from the hard cam side. Sounded like a gunshot. It was a great return for Duggan, though. And obviously we've had a lot of concerns surrounding his disappearance in the last month. I think it's been a little longer than that. The last time Duggan was around, he had wrestled in that coal miner's glove match with the Russians. Found himself getting laid out with the glove and injured as a result. So he's standing next to JR for an interview. Or what was supposed to be an interview, but I think Duggan jumped the gun. Started talking before JR could even ask the question. He said he's been sitting at home doing some thinking about Crusher Darso for a while. Ever since that coal miner's glove match. Every time he eats, brushes his teeth, washes his hair, takes a shit. Darso's on his mind. For the record, he never actually referred to him as Crusher Khrushchev during any part of this promo. So apparently nobody informed him of the name change. But he wants a coal miner's glove match with Khrushchev to get even. And, well, JR just kind of stood there limp dick through the whole thing. Good to see Duggan back, though. Crowd was sure happy to see him. Then we had Buddy Landel versus Magnum TA. Great match. One thing you can always bet on with a Magnum TA performance. When that guy's pissed off, he can pull out some great matches. You could see during a few moments in this thing, the belt markings on his back from where the Midnight strapped him. What a visual. God, I can only imagine how much of a bitch it was for him trying to take bumps. I mean, it wasn't the longest match in the world, but the work between both guys was tremendous. Buddy caught off Magnum, worked him over for a little bit. But, I mean, the goal was definitely to put over Magnum strong here. He is still the current #1 contender to the North American title, in case you forgot about that little clause. So he had one agenda: get the win over Buddy and then put all my focus on beating the fuck out of Wrestling 2. Because you know that's the only thing on Magnum's mind at the moment. That took us to Masayo Ito and Hacksaw Butch Reed versus Obi Davis and Josh Stroud. Interesting choice to have Masayo Ito team with Reed this week instead of Buddy. I don't know, maybe they didn't want Ito to drop a pinfall. It's a decent little slugfest. Reed absolutely maimed Obi Dennis in this thing. Or Davis, whatever the hell his name was. Killed him with a lariat at one point. He also nearly squashed Joel Watts in the corner when he tried to go up for a leg drop. But Reed did the bulk of the work before he tagged in Ito so he could hit a chop and then pin Davis. And then the last several minutes of remaining airtime were left for them to go back and replay the cake angle we saw earlier. And they set up beforehand, this was a request on behalf of Bill Watts, which is going to be very important for story reasons. He specifically went to Oral Link and requested that they cue up the footage and relive the iconic moment one more time to have a good laugh at the Midnight's expense. And then after revisiting the footage, we cut to JR at ringside, who was standing next to Jim Cornette, still with cake shards in his hair. Although he's cleaned himself up a little bit by this point. And as expected, he's hot. It's bad enough that they humiliated him once on the show this week, and now Midsouth is playing the cake angle a second time just to humiliate him even further. He says that he has enough money to sue everybody in the studio, including the fans. And as he's ranting to JR, Bill Watts finally comes over to set everything straight. He assumes responsibility for having the footage aired a second time, because he called for it to be shown. He's the boss. He's in charge. So if Cornette wants to blame anybody, he can address Watts and leave everybody else out of it. And this is where shit really gets good. Because now Corny's going off on Watts, saying that he's made it a mission to criticize him and talk down on him ever since the Midnight Express came to Mid-South. Meanwhile, Watts is making it a goal to stand up for his friends and the people that benefit him the most. And this next part is absolutely glorious. I had to single this bit of dialogue out purely because of the interplay between Bill Watts and JR here. Like, I had to go back and rewatch it, certain segments of this, because I could not stop watching JR's reactions. He was fucking amazing during all of this. JC's calling Watts a big mouth, telling him not to interrupt when he's talking. At one point he goes, "You got a mouth full of memories, but you can't back them up anymore." And you look at JR's face, he just goes, "Ooh." Or like at one point, Watts turned his head to look at JR as Corny's in the middle of his ranting. JR just turns his head to the side and starts laughing to himself. Like, this fucking guy right here, he's gonna get it. And he got it. JC absolutely got it by the end of this segment. It's great, though, because the whole time, Watts is trying to remain very cordial, very professional. He's just letting Corny go off and say his piece, get it all off his chest. And then it starts to get really heated when JC brings up the idea of trying to buy Midsouth from under Watts' nose. But instead of firing him, he'll keep him and his geeky son around so he can humiliate them both. Saying he's going to have his son selling Midnight Express t-shirts while Bill's swabbing toilets and cleaning floors. And okay, now is where shit starts to get really personal. You know, it's one thing for Cornette to go off on Watts. Now he's bringing his family and his son into this. And that's crossing a line. He's already been physical by touching Bill on the shoulder and poking him in the chest over and over again. He's getting fed up with it. So Bill tries to be the better man. Says he's going to walk away before he does something he'll regret. And this pipsqueak Jim Cornette just couldn't leave well enough alone, brother. He had to keep poking the bear. So Watts grabs Cornette by the wrist, tells him that he's not equipped to get physical with him because he's a sissy. And if he ever brings up his family again, he's going to pay for it. So again, tries to walk away. But Corny wanted to get the last word in. So he tried to grab Watts by the shoulder one more time. And Watts turns around. He extends his palm outward. And he smacks, and I do mean smacks the shit out of Jim Cornette. And if you've never seen this before, you have to go watch the footage. This is such an iconic bump. I think Jim's even gone back and recounted the story over the years during interviews. He admits to miscalculating the distance from where he was standing to where the ring apron was. So it ends up being one of those hilarious bumps where he ends up flying backwards out of the shot, but his legs end up catching the side of the ring as he goes down. So he basically ends up taking a flip bump onto his side and face on the concrete. And the initial shot is hilarious because the only thing you see in the frame are his legs kicking out as he goes flying backwards. But then you see his entire body rotate as he's going out of the shot. There's a split frame where you actually see his feet hit the side of the ring, causing him to flip over. I'll be honest with you, I have no earthly clue how JR and Watts kept a straight face. I don't think I would have been able to. I would have ruined the whole moment. I would have cracked. Again, dude, another textbook example of they could have shot that segment 1,000,000 times. It would have never outshined the first one. That whole interaction was just phenomenal. And it helped to launch the next chapter in the Midnight Express versus Bill Watts story, which we're really going to see come to a head over the series of the next several weeks. I mean, you think up to this point, it was mostly all fun and games. right up until that slap heard around the nation. And now it's personal between both parties. But that's how it still remains an all-time classic angle. The cake angle and the closing segment with Watts and Cornette. It's brilliant stuff. Could not have asked for a better outcome. And I was thinking about it too when I was watching the show. One thing I haven't really mentioned, Bill Dundee was already booking for Midsouth by this point. And that was another huge bonus as to why the booking was so great around this time. Bill had already been booking in Memphis all those years. He had the experience and the knowledge. And remember, back when Watts was down in Memphis doing that talent scouting thing in late 83, that was right around the time where Dundee was finishing up in Memphis, and he was looking to join Watts to come take the book in Mid-South. Obviously not without having Watts' input, because they were working side by side through a lot of this. But, he was very influential. You look at the television product and you're thinking, well, who's responsible for all this great material? Dundee was coming up with a lot of it. And he was somebody that Watts could trust, because it's not like Dundee was coming in to book himself on top as the main babyface. But like all these Memphis-style angles you've been seeing on TV, most, if not all of them, are brainchildren of Dundee. Just taking a formula that worked great in the Tennessee territory and trying to replicate the same formula in Mid-South to help get over all the top programs. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It worked for that crowd, and it worked for the Louisiana crowd. You just add it as another layer as to what helped make Mid-South must-see television in 1984. It's not just everything you're seeing happening in front of the camera. It's everything that's happening behind the camera, too, that makes it all go. All right, let's round this out with a world-class recap. And I do mean it this time. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time dissecting this one. I've already burnt myself out with the NWA and Mid-South reviews. Totally worth it. But I'm getting a little fatigued. So using one of my favorite Joe Pesci quotes, we're going to make this a simple in and out procedure. Name that movie line. We open this week with Steve Regal taking on Mark Youngblood. Regal made his world-class debut the other week. So if you want to hear a brief overview on Steve Regal, you can go check out my review the other week. It's not a 45-minute biography covering everything about his career, but a brief synopsis. Mr. Electricity is what they called Steve Regal here. He was about as electric as a faulty car battery. And I mean that in the nicest manner possible. No offense to Regal, but giving him the moniker of Mr. Electricity, that was a bit of a stretch even for me. Maybe it was a way for Bill Mercer to avoid having to call him Steve Regal, because he was really struggling at certain points to get his name right. At one point, he got so tongue-tied, he wound up calling him Steve Seagull. I was like, did Mercer just call him Steve Seagull? Or did he just mispronounce Steven Seagal? The match is all right. Decent back and forth. I have no idea where the hell Youngblood bought all that Native American apparel he came out with, but he certainly went all out. This kind of goes back to a similar discussion we had about Regal the other week. He was a good worker, but I don't really think he had crowd heat with the Dallas faithful. I mean, they booed whenever he would try to strike a bicep pose or do something dastardly to Youngblood behind Rick Hazard's back. But it wasn't the Freebird kind of heel heat where you knew he was actually over. Part of the other problem, I think, was that he was wrestling Mark Youngblood, who was also not over. So it was hard to get babyface sympathy on him. See, kind of just had a cold prelim with two guys that the fans were more or less ambivalent towards. And we've definitely seen that issue come up a time or two in the last year. Regal ended up cutting off Youngblood during the comeback. Gave him a sloppy-looking hotshot stun gun into the ropes. Then he hit a belly-to-belly suplex for the pin. God, what is it with guys fucking up the stun gun back in the 80s? Every single time I see it, whether it's Eddie Gilbert doing it in the NWA, or now Steve Regal attempting it in World Class, it always looks butchered all to hell. It's either the guy giving the move is too far away from the ropes, or the guy taking it doesn't have enough momentum going to try to drape himself over the top of the rope. I mean, this one I think was Regal's fault for being way too close to the ropes. I guess it is kind of a difficult move to hit, right? I mean, you can't really see behind you as you're giving it to somebody. So you basically have to blindly hope that you're close enough to the ropes to pull it off. Or the guy taking it has good depth perception. Probably a valid reason we don't see the hotshot stun gun used all that often anymore. Then we came back for Buddy Roberts and Mike Reed. The very first thing I wrote down about this: holy shit, Buddy might actually win a match for a change. How about that? I can't remember the last time they gave Buddy Roberts a standalone squash or get-over match. Most of the time he's getting served up to one of the babyfaces or taking the fall in tag matches with Hayes and Gordy. Can't really say I was craving a Buddy Roberts singles match, especially by 1986. I mean, what was it? That tag match he worked with Michael Hayes a couple weeks ago? That was one of the weaker Buddy Roberts performances I've seen since we started these world-class reviews. And that was a tag match. But it makes sense. He only had a few more years before he retired. We obviously weren't getting the 1979 version of Buddy here when he first joined up with Gordy and Hayes to form the official three-man Freebird team. It is sad because you think, Buddy was how old? Was he 20 when he first broke into the business? Yeah, Watts came up with the Freebird team in 79. I guess they weren't a full-fledged pairing until more like 1980. But even so, Buddy would have been in his early 30s by that point. I don't even think he was 40 by the year 1986. But man, you just look at the way he was moving at this point. You could tell his body was really banged up. But he wasn't old. That's a crazy thing. He just had a really rough road schedule. All that wear and tear on his body just finally caught up with him in the late 80s. Anyway, he went over with a bulldog here, and that finally ends Buddy Roberts' world-class losing streak after approximately 587 consecutive losses. It was probably more like 12. We had a John Tatum and Grappler versus Brian Adias Jerry Allen tag. This actually ended up being pretty fun, I'll admit. Mostly thanks to the heels. The babyface team sucked. Brian Adias is still drier than a nun's cunt to watch. One of the most boring professional wrestlers I've ever seen. I mean, the guy was a good athlete, don't get me wrong, but holy fuck. Did he have more than one singular facial expression? Other than moop face? I love Jim Cornette, you all know that. But as much shit as he gives Johnny Gargano for having the most one-dimensional bland facial expression, Brian Adias looks like an android when he works. Just a resting, bored frown face through the entire god-blessed match. Even when he's selling, he doesn't show any emotion. So the heels carried the whole thing. They did some comedy spots early on, like the drop-down spot where Grappler went to tag in Tatum, and then Tatum and Adias did drop-down spots while the Grappler was hitting the ropes. Then the heels ended up colliding with one another when Adias got out of the way. They also did the classic double heel bonk spot during the four-way brawl at the end. The more I watch John Tatum, the more he grows on me. I remember when we started these world-class reviews, I was not the biggest John Tatum fan. But he and Missy Hyatt have been one of the most entertaining parts to this program lately. I was getting a little fed up with their high school breakup, get back together storyline they were doing for like 8 goddamn weeks straight, where they would supposedly break up after Tatum lost a match, but then they would just show up the next week peachy as clams like nothing ever happened, only for Missy to get mad at him again. Like, that whole thing was just going nowhere. But the story they've implemented where Missy's working to ensure that Tatum never loses another match, and now Tatum's on this win streak, finding ways to topple the babyface opposition, that's been getting over. And it was funny here because Missy didn't even have to get involved to help Tatum cheat. Tatum just capitalized while Bronco was tied up with the Grappler and Adias in the corner. Then he came off the top rope with an elbow drop and got the pin on Jerry Allen. Somehow that didn't lead to a DQ, even though Bronco clearly saw Tatum coming off the top rope to hit an illegal offensive move. But whatever. I'm so used to rules and regulations getting thrown out the window in pro wrestling. I'm just numb to bad officiating by this point, especially after watching the modern product. Fans chanted for Sunshine afterwards, so they're obviously not done with that Missy Sunshine story yet. I mean, that's probably going to be something they drag all the way out to Texas Stadium at the rate they're going. But we close out with the main event of Michael Hayes and Lance Von Erich. I'm sure you're all immediately thinking, oh good God, how bad was it? Actually, surprisingly, it was not horrible. I was expecting far worse than what we got. Even with Hayes doing his pre-match showboating and hot dogging for the camera, they still ended up wrestling for another 10 minutes afterwards. The finish was rotten, but I'll get to that in a minute. Again, it's Lance Von Erich. He's not a technical mastermind in the ring, but he could work. They kept everything moderately basic. Lance ran wild early on, got the babyface shine. Hayes worked him over for some heat. They did some trading back and forth. And, well, here's where things get wonky. They were going for the spot where Hayes went to shoot Lance off into the ropes. Lance was supposed to duck down, hit the other side. And then as Hayes went to do the crossbody attack onto Lance, he would roll through and then stack up Hayes for the surprise 3. But it was one of those sloppy reversals where Lance had trouble turning Hayes over from the crossbody. So, like, Hayes had to pretend like he couldn't just lift his shoulders off the mat as Lance was basically laying on top of his stomach and crotch. Just didn't work in execution. But the crowd, of course, popped because, well, it's a Von Erich pinning a Freebird. When is that not going to get over? Even though it's a fake Von Erich. It's weird because, you know, all the documentaries and biographies you've seen over the years, people talking about Lance and how he was sort of exposed very early on. I don't know how smart the Dallas crowd was to it, how much they were willing to play along in the short term, but like, I mean, he is getting genuine babyface reactions. They're not booing him out of the building. So it's weird. It's kind of like that revisionist history where you go back and rewatch the footage in real time and you're like, even if they secretly knew Lance wasn't a real Von Erich, they didn't hate him. They weren't booing him. They just kind of treated him like he was another one of the boys. Popularity, that is. It's weird. And then afterwards, the heels jumped Lance and pinned him down so Buddy could take off his cowboy boot and then go to hit Lance over the hand with it a couple times. Same injury angle they used on Kerry in the parking lot. Allegedly. I say allegedly because we never actually saw any tape of that occurring. We were just told last week that Kerry had a busted left hand, courtesy of the Freebirds attacking him in the parking lot. Who knows if that was real or not. Overall, not a bad match. A lot of this Freebird Von Erich stuff right now is making me question what the hell they're setting up for Texas Stadium. I mean, good Christ. If it just winds up being another standard six-man tag with Hayes, Gordy, and Roberts against Kevin, Kerry, and Lance. I honestly don't even know what to say at this point. That's probably where it's all going. But then there's a part of me that's like, they have to be setting up something better. I mean, I'm assuming they're setting up some kind of championship match. They instituted the new rule with the belts in World Class where now titles can change hands on a DQ or a count out. I have to presume that role doesn't just go for the World Heavyweight title, but it would include all the belts. So they might try to implement that as a story technique to get the belts back on the Von Erichs. I don't know. Again, any history knowledge I have of World Class post-84 is hit and miss. There's certain things that I remember, certain things that I don't. This period is just such a blur. Because I know we're coming up on the Kerry Von Erich motorcycle accident. And I'm trying to remember when that is. That was after the May Parade of Champions, right? I think that was toward the beginning of the summer. And he was out for a long time. That whole thing really fucked him up for the rest of his life. The whole foot amputation, him getting hooked on painkillers. He was just never the same. I don't even know how much of that was documented in the triumph and tragedy of World Class Championship Wrestling. When did WWE put that out? Mid-2000s? It was a while ago. I'm going to need to go back and rewatch some bits and pieces of that thing just to see how much of it I actually remember. I remember the talking heads were great. Gary Hart, Skandar Akbar, Kevin Von Erich, obviously, Hayes, Jimmy Garvin, I think, was there. And everybody looked so young back then. And of course, they had to throw Hunter in there for Christ knows what reason. Like he actually knew jack shit about world-class history. Give me a fucking break. If only I had time. If only I had time to binge watch every god-blessed thing on the network. What I would pay to go back 20 years and be a kid all over again. If I could work a part-time job, make some income, and then spend 8 or 9 hours just deep diving into wrestling history and watching everything on the WWE network. Dude, I'd be a savant. I'd have more knowledge than any of the experts in the business today. But it doesn't pan out that way sometimes. Or as the Iceman would say, it's got to be that way sometimes. Well, that'll wrap up this one, because this show's been off the rails since I hit the record button. Folks, thanks for stopping by to check out this Friday edition of the FSWR channel. We will be back on... the hell was that? We will be back on Monday. We will cover Retro Raw. I don't really have a secondary topical discussion at hand, so it'll probably just be a shorter podcast. I haven't been checking out my analytics to see how the John Cena discussion went, but we will see. We will see. He did a promo on Raw this past week. It was quite lame. I could do another 15-minute tangent on that, but nah, this podcast is already too long anyway. Maybe another time. So we'll see you, everybody, and have a good weekend. Take care. Peace out.